So I have two basic goals for what I'm going to be talking about. The first is I'm going to talk about two projects that look at specific psychological interventions and how they affect voter participation. And so these are two specific insights and interventions. But the second goal is a bigger picture. I've spent the last 7 years focused on looking at how psychology can translate into political interventions and political strategies. And over the course of the talk, I'm going to cover a bunch of these projects. And I just want to show what the kind of progress that focused research can do on a single topic. And I think we've seen a lot of that with education. And this is an example in the voter participation space. So background on me, I finished grad school at the end of 2007, and in 2008 started a research institute in DC where I worked with the infrastructure of progressive groups and translated behavioral science insights into political strategy for progressives. And so over the course of the last 4 years, probably conducted 300 or 400 large-scale field experiments looking at things like how do we increase turnout, how do we increase donation, how do we increase volunteering, how do we increase calling your legislator and civic engagement, how do we increase candidate support, things like that. I'm allowed to talk about the voting stuff only. So that's what I'll be talking about. But focused effort with 300 or more of these large-scale field experiments, we've made tons of progress. And the work that I'm going to talk about in voter mobilization, we estimate probably triples the cost effectiveness of a dollar spent on voter mobilization relative to where it was just in 2006. And so I will get started with there. So voter mobilization not long ago, that handsome man with a full head of hair is me in 2004, I think, or 2003, something. But I was volunteering for a campaign, and I was calling this woman, and I would read the standard script, which is, hello, Mrs. Smith, it's easy to vote. The issues at stake are important. It's going to be close, so your vote matters. It's your civic duty to vote. Do you intend to vote? Almost always, she would say, yes, I intend to vote. I would say, great, thanks, have a nice night. So that's the completely standard voter mobilization script. And if you look at it, not even that carefully, but if you just look at it, you can see that it is totally rational. So the first piece is it's inexpensive to vote. The issues at stake are important, so it's important. Multiply that by how close it is. So your likelihood of being the pivotal voter is high. And it's your civic duty. So this is from political science and economics, the rational voter theorem. And this is the standard script inspired totally by rational perspective. So from 1998 to 2004, Alan Gerber and Don Green at Yale conducted dozens of large-scale field experiments looking at voter mobilization messaging. We'll call it GOTV. It's get out the vote messaging. And they looked at, so what's the impact of emphasizing that it's easy to vote? Turns out that that is irrelevant for whether the impact of these messages. Then isolated emphasizing that it's important or not, and they found that that has no impact on turnout. They then emphasized whether it was close or not. That has no impact on turnout. And then finally, they checked, does emphasizing it's your civic duty increase turnout? It has no impact on turnout. And you guys thought that we were leading up to civic duty. No. So they conclude, after dozens of experiments looking at these topics, that mobilization content does not matter. In this meta-analysis, big review that they write, it doesn't matter what you say, so long as you talk to people in a personal way. So if canvassing door-to-door is more effective than talking on the phone, which is more effective than mail, which is more effective than robocalls, right? And so they find that just the more personal, the more effective, it doesn't matter what the content is. And so that's where we take off. Now the psychologists join the party. And in fact, these people, Alan Gerber and Don Green, are the leaders in this. They've started doing some really fascinating psychologically informed voter mobilization messaging. But that's where we're going to start off. So the overview of what I'm going to cover, the first is the whole project is rethinking why people vote outside of these rational, self-interested reasons. And so the first is thinking of voting as a logistics and planning problem, not just as a motivation problem. That's what the first paper is on. The second is, so before we get to the next project, I'll cover a bunch of other projects we've done that rethinks why people vote from a bunch of different psychological perspectives. And then finally, some work that we're doing right now on leveraging social motivations and social accountability. So the first paper is on having a voting plan. And so it's inspired by this work in cognitive psychology that really began on how to get people to take their medications. And one of the best ways to get people to take their meds is to have them schedule it and make a plan, right? And psychologists have looked into this, and there's this high-level goal intention, which is I intend to do something. And then there's a much lower level concrete implementation element to that plan. Those are called implementation intentions. There's the goal intention and then the logistical details. And so there's been a lot of research on how that affects people's likelihood of following through on their intentions by visualizing and unpacking their implementation steps. There are two benefits that come from this kind of plan making. One is a psychological process, which is that as the situation arises, when I said that so when am I going to walk over to that corner? Well, just before I start showing data on the plan making. Well, then just before I start showing data on this, I'll realize that I said I was going to do that, and then it'll pop like sort of a reminder on your computer. It'll pop and just become accessible. That's sort of the cognitive process. But there's also a purely scheduling element, which is without thinking something through, you haven't put it in your calendar, you haven't made sure that you have time to do it, right? So we are going to look at whether this kind of planning element is a way to increase people's participation in elections. So this experiment involves 300,000 people in the Pennsylvania 2008 primary. So it's Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and the election is not yet resolved. And these are what Pennsylvanians look like. Some of my family members married Pennsylvanians that look like that. So this is to illustrate how the experiment works. Just so we've talked a lot about randomized experiments and not really gotten into the weeds on it. So I think of behavioral science, psychology and behavioral economics, and other related disciplines as having two major contributions. The first is the set of insights about human behavior, which is really what we talk about and the sort of really popular in the press and what this entire conference is focused on. The other is very sophisticated ways of isolating causal relationships, right? Which is rather than relying on observational data, we can conduct randomized trials to figure out what works and what doesn't, both in the field but also in the lab. And this is an artifact of me this visual, which you'll see again, is an artifact of me trying to explain to people how experiments work. So these Pennsylvanians get assigned to one of four different conditions. A control group, which gets no phone call, a standard voter mobilization call, which is we encourage you to vote, there's an election, please vote. A standard plus a do you intend to vote, which is a self-prediction. And then a standard, we encourage you to vote, do you intend to vote? If yes, which in this experiment, as nearly is always the case, 95% of people said yes, they intend to vote. When will you vote? How will you get there? Where will you be coming from? So we add this battery of questions that is simply a plan-making battery. And so then these Pennsylvanians get assigned to the four different conditions. What's nice, so we don't take, so this is what randomization allows us to do is these people are identical to each other, all these different conditions are identical on the factors that we are aware of, gender, age, race, but also because they were randomly assigned, they're identical on all these other dimensions too. So any difference in turnout we can attribute causally to the difference in the script. And then they vote or not. And then, I had right here. So most people aren't aware of this, but it's public record whether you vote in the United States. So it's there. I have access to all of your voting records if I had your names and addresses, which is why I'm so surprised that this guy didn't vote in the last election. Mel, come on. Okay, I must have the wrong address. So it's public record. So we run this experiment after the election. We look and see who voted and who didn't, right? So what we find so the y-axis here, the vertical axis, it shows the difference between this condition and the control group in turnout, right? And what we find is that calling people and encouraging them to vote, please vote, please vote, please vote, millions of dollars are spent on calls like this, has no effect, which is consistent with literally dozens of experiments, that people are not failing to vote in elections because they don't know there's an election. And they don't know that they should vote in the election. And they don't know that people want them to vote in the election. Adding self-prediction, adding do you intend to vote, yields a 2 percentage point increase in turnout. And that, up to the point of this experiment, was the most sophisticated call that was done in voter mobilization. And then adding the plan-making battery more than doubles the impact of the call, right? So this was done in the primaries of 2008. In the generals, the results were available by then. In the generals, some of you may have received or made calls that involve the plan-making piece. But what we found later is, as we look closely at the data, we see that the entire, so I should, before showing the data, so we stratified, we split the sample in advance by the household composition. So people who live by themselves versus people who live with other eligible voters. And we were interested at this point in seeing whether increasing turnout among one person within a household spills over to the person they live with. So that was why we cut the data this way. But we end up seeing that the entire treatment effect occurs among people who live by themselves, single eligible voter households. So again, this is that condition versus the control group. And so people who live single eligible voter households who receive the plan-making battery were 9 percentage points more likely to vote than single eligible voter households who in the control group. And that the entire effect seems to be driven by these single eligible voter households. And that multiple eligible voter households, people who live with other people, didn't seem to be responsive to this plan-making intervention. So we thought, why might this be? And so wrote it in large font. Why might this be? And so one idea is that it's possible that people who live by themselves are less likely to have organically discussed whether they're going to vote the next day and the logistics of whether they're going to vote the next day, right? So I live by myself. I don't have to talk with anybody about sharing my car, about my plan the next day, about what I'm doing tomorrow. If I live with somebody, we may have to negotiate about car, childcare, et cetera. We also have to fill the time. We may actually talk about what we're going to do the next day, right? And so it's possible that people who live by themselves are just less likely to have organically already had a plan at the point of our intervention, which is why our intervention would be less effective for people who live with multiple people, because they may be more likely to have the plan. So when we collected the data from the phone calls, we actually incidentally collected not what time they were going to vote and where they were going to be coming from and how they were going to get there, but we just asked the vendor, incidentally, totally by accident, to record whether the person offered an answer or said don't know. So we end up having data on that. And so the hypothesis here is if people who live by themselves are less likely to have organically made a plan, they should be more likely to say don't know to all of these questions. Clear? Yeah? Okay. And so that's what we find for all of them, is that multiple eligible voter households are much more likely to say, I don't know what time I'm going to vote. I don't know where I'll be coming from. I don't know what I'll be doing beforehand, right? Which is consistent with an interpretation that perhaps one of the reasons they're not voting, or one of the reasons the plan-making intervention is more effective on them, is because they don't have, at the point of the intervention, an already made plan, right? So, is this clear? I'm just going to ask. Okay. So the summary of this project is just this kind of research teaches us something that is, from a political science standpoint, useful and new, in that it's rethinking the failure to participate in the election as not just a motivation problem, but also it's a logistical problem. From a psychological standpoint, we learn a little bit about this plan making and implementation intentions as we think about translating these things into the field, and we think about how do we make this science of psychology and human behavior useful. It turns out in the world, some people are more responsive than other people. And so we saw with the education stuff that the affirmation is most effective for groups that have pre-existing stereotypes that they perform poorly. And I think the belonging showed the same moderation. So as we translate these things, these are not universally applicable. They're applicable to segments that we can theoretically predict should be more or less responsive. And then finally, this generates a scalable intervention that, has anyone here ever received or delivered a get out the vote phone call that involves a plan-making battery? All right. Yeah, that is entirely, I'll say it, that's entirely because of this research. It's possible that somebody else may have just made it up, but before 2008, it had never really been done, and now it's a completely common part of voter mobilization messaging. So this is the first project, rethinks voting as a planning failure, not just as a motivation failure. A separate project, which I'm not really going to get into, but I'm just going to cover, and this actually is a nice foreshadowing of Tom's presentation on descriptive social norms. What we do in a different project is we emphasize that turnout is going to be high, that the vast majority, and this experiment, we have several of them, but this experiment occurred in the New Jersey governor's election. We tell some people turnout's going to be high, a vast majority of people voted in the last election. It was the most ever, 20% more than the previous, join your fellow voters. And then others we tell it's low turnout. We say voter turnout was the lowest, it was down 7%, less than 10% voted. All of these are true statements. So they're interesting. So this is true in the primary election leading up before this governor's race. Only 10% of people voted, of eligible people voted, which was 20% more than the previous primary. So they are all true. And what we find is that high turnout message is much more motivating than the low turnout message. And we will hear more about this later. This was in the 2007 New Jersey governor's race. And so now I imagine in those people who had their hands up, they may not have noticed it, but I imagine your scripts also included lots of people are voting, lots of other people are voting, things like that. In another project with a corner of this room as collaborators, we think of voting as some form of self-expression, as not just the sort of self-interested voting because of instrumental reasons, but also as in part trying to express oneself and associate oneself with a positive set of behaviors. And so we administer a couple of different experiments, but they all have this basic form, in that half the people answer questions in which we say, how important is it for you to vote? And the other half we say, how important is it for you to be a voter? Right? And so to be a voter is expressing that you are the kind of person who votes. Right? This is like an identity reinforcing assertion. And then to vote is just, it's an action you can take, but it's not core to who you are. And we find is that this arrow is actually in the wrong spot. I'm going to change it. There. That's how science works. Yeah, that's right. And what we find is that asserting that you're the kind of person who votes, the sort of making voting relevant to the self and sort of affirming the self and making it, asserting that you're the kind of person who does this, also increases people's likelihood of voting. And so we should say, include elements that say, as the kind of person who votes, as a voter, things like that. Another project, which is right here, so this is an example of a project. This is rethinking voting as a sort of social contract where you tell people you're going to do it, and you tell yourself that you're going to do it. And we're trying to heighten the cost of not following through with what you said to other people and to yourself. And so this is with a coalition of student groups in the 2008 election. Some people here probably recognize a lot of these groups. And what we do is we have people sign a pledge to vote. We have people sign a pledge to vote, and then we mail it back to them the weekend before the election. And so they've said they're going to vote, and then half of them get it back, half of them don't. And we find is that this is one of the most potent tools that we've identified to increase turnout, is to get people to in their own handwriting, say they're going to do it, and then return it to them beforehand. So here's what I said to this woman, Mrs. Smith. It's easy to vote. The issues at stake are important. It's going to be close, so your vote matters. It's your civic responsibility to vote. Do you intend to vote? I could have said anything I wanted and had the same effect. But now we should say lots of others will vote. You should join them. Do you intend to vote? Yes. Great. Voters like you make a difference. Sometimes it helps to make a plan. What time will you vote, etc. You'll get a reminder in the mail of your pledge right now. Thanks for being a voter. And this is very similar, I imagine, to the script that many people are now using. In fact, so this is an example in 2010. It's a national security group sending out the morning of the election. What's your plan? We are a community of people who care about voters. We are a community of voters, people who care about the election. Turnout's going to be high. Do you have a plan? Right. So this is a national security group. This is the Democratic National Committee's volunteer script for the Colorado 2010 Senate race. So they start by saying, we are calling voters like you. Thank you for being a voter. Since you're the kind of, this was overkill. Now, since you're the kind of person who votes, we've been calling people in your city. It looks like a lot of people are going to vote today. Do you have a plan? Do you know what time you'll be going, et cetera? So then this is another one from Organizing for America, which is a branch of the Democratic National Committee saying, do you have a voting plan? Asking people in advance to make a plan. This is Michelle Obama saying, now it's time to make plans. And Obama saying, supporters like you. And it's been widely promulgated. And in fact, I think that, do I have it here? Yes, this is my favorite one. So a few months ago, I got this email from the Democratic National Committee saying, make a plan to vote in November of 2012. Yeah. So I think that this is sort of, seems a little bit long for me to be creating cognitive cues for November 6th. But what I bet they're going to do is they're probably going to mail this back to me in my own words right before the election, that on whatever day I filled this out. So, but before we move past that, this is going to be important for the next study. So this is another one that's going to be overkill. We sent this to 700,000 households in the 2010 election. We'll get into that in a second. But so here's the contents. You're a voter. Thank you for voting in 2010. Public records show people like you, hundreds of thousands of others cast a vote. So lots of people will vote. It's important. You were a voter then. You're still a voter. Make a plan. Will you vote? And the details, public records, other elements, right? And then this. And so now I'm going to get to the second new project related to this, which is rethinking how to influence turnout by thinking about it as a way to, increase and heighten the social element to it. And so we increase the accountability thread and we add to the communications, we may call you after the election to discuss your voting experience. And so we may call you after the election to discuss your voting experience. So just to start on this project, there's amazing research that Alan Gerber and Don Green have done where they send people their vote histories and the vote history of all their neighbors, because it's public record, and then they send it to their neighbors, and they tell everyone after the election we're going to send an update so everybody knows who voted and who didn't. No independent group is willing to do it despite it being massively potent because it's creepy. It's amazing. So when they did the experiment, I don't think I have a picture of it, but it was just this like super weird dot matrix thing that just looks like it's official, but it also only has a PO box, really cryptic and weird. And so the PO box, rumor is that the PO box was staked out by the local television station to figure out who was behind it because it had all this buzz. But it conflates lots of different potential treatments. So if you were to discern what element of that treatment seemed to be so potent, it'd be hard. There are lots of things that contribute to that. So in this project, I'm looking at one element that is slightly different, which is how does the threat of post-election personal accountability affect participation? Right, so we may call you after the election. And so this relates to this research that Phil Tetlock and Jen Lerner summarize in a great and dense paper where they talk about this flexible contingency model, which is basically that when people know the socially desirable response, adding accountability will make them shift in the direction of the socially desirable response. Not surprising, but nearly all the work focuses on attitudes. So it turns out people's attitudes will move in the direction of their audience, but very little, if any, I couldn't find any that has a real field demonstration of behavior shifting in the direction of the accountability threat. So this is the mailing we just saw. I will in a second show the experimental design, but what we add, look up here, we just add this little box. You may be called after the election to discuss your experience of the polls. And then there's a paragraph down here where we just reiterate it. We may call you after the election. So basically it's a really subtle, just adding, we may call you after the election. So here, it turns out the rest of the country looks just like Pennsylvania. And these are the three conditions. I should say we choose the 28 closest congressional battlegrounds in the 2010 election. So these are the most expensive races where the most money is spent, and they have the closest outcomes. I should also say the treatment effects. So this, I think, is just useful to think about for all of this research. The treatment effects are very specific to context. So rank order of treatments, the prediction here is that adding accountability threat will increase turnout relative to not having it. But whether the difference is 5% to 10% or 0.1% to 0.2%, the important element for us is how do we costlessly increase the effectiveness of these treatments. And what I have found across lots of these different election contexts is that the context really determines the treatment effect. And so this is all a preamble to make you judge me less harshly when you see small average treatment effects. So this is what it looks like. So they get randomly assigned. And I think that it is this is where little moving people is really useful just from a method standpoint. They are randomly assigned even though they are not equal proportioned. Right? So the population in the control group is identical in all observable and unobservable ways, but it's just we end up tinkering with the proportions. Just because we want to maximize, the group that we're working with, America Votes, wants to maximize the number of people who are getting treatment, and they're not that comfortable holding that big a control group out. 80,000 is still pretty big. So what we find is that turnout in the control group is 45%. So the mailing is the most psychologically sophisticated piece of mail that we have ever developed, which includes everything we've ever learned. And that has about a 0.6 percentage point effect on turnout. And just adding the accountability threat increases it by about 40%, but 0.2 percentage points. Right? So it almost becomes 50%, it's 40% more effective by adding the accountability threat versus not. I should, because our IRB requires it, we did hand dial some of these people. So we said we may call you. Every person had an equal probability of getting dialed. We randomly sampled 10 out of the 700,000 people and hand dialed them so that we actually sort of honored the commitment just from an ethics standpoint. So a couple months later, for a different reason, we conduct a survey of, because we're interested in the downstream consequences of inducing people to vote. And so we conduct a survey of these three groups. And the survey contains basically questions from on social capital, like Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone. A lot of these are just ripped from that. And they ask, how many amendments are in the Bill of Rights? Who's currently the Speaker of the House? Have you forwarded a news story, volunteered, contact public officials, signed a petition, et cetera? And so what we find is that 14 to about a third of people get any one of these questions right. And there's no difference across conditions, which should be expected. We didn't know what the turnout effect was until 6 months after the election, but it's not surprising. With small treatment effects, there's unlikely that we would ever see big downstream effects from a very small treatment effect. If anybody wants to discuss that, that's a not important detail. Have run dozens of these experiments where we do mail-based treatments and then do phone calls, usually persuasion-focused, and we always see these massive, 10 percentage points is massive, these massive differences between treatment and control in remembering receiving the mail. So this is just like the experiment occurred, we know that it worked because the control group was 10 percentage points less likely to say they received our mail. They're 40% still said they got it when they didn't, but we get a difference between treatment and control. But so what this allows us to do is we can now see if the people who got the psychologically sophisticated piece of mail and the psychologically sophisticated plus the accountability, what is adding accountability? So now we're just comparing these two groups. What's the effect of adding the accountability? And so now we look at people who answered correctly how many amendments are in the Bill of Rights. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, 10. So there are 10. And so what we have here is we're going to split. This is the easiest way to do it, I think. So what we're going to do is we're going to split. These are the people who answered it correctly. Now, among people who knew that there were 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, those who got the accountability threat were 12 percentage points more likely to vote than those who did not. Right? So the accountability adding the accountability was super effective for people who knew how many amendments were in the Bill of Rights, and there was no difference for people who didn't know how many amendments were in the Bill of Rights. Right? The same pattern for Speaker of the House, for forwarded a news story, for volunteered, for all of the questions. Basically, the people who answered these civic engagement questions correctly or affirmatively were more likely to showed a bigger treatment effect for adding accountability threat. So what that allows us to look at is we create this index of all these questions, and what we see is that those who are civically engaged, who talk about politics, know about politics, forward news stories, et cetera, are massively responsive, 12 percentage points more likely to vote when they get the accountability threat versus just getting the mailer. And those who are not engaged show no average treatment effect. Right? And so just like in the plan making, what we see here is that we have these average treatment effects, but they can be massively amped up, and they're entirely explained by a segment of the people being very responsive and another segment not. So I will skip these, and we end up with the summary, accountability threat summary, which is basically accountability threat increases participation. It makes the treatment 40% more effective. Those who are most civically engaged are the most responsive to turnout accountability threat. But then the question from a sort of conceptual standpoint is, what does civically engaged mean? I think it means people who believe they should perform this behavior. Right? So it's a combination of people who are knowledgeable and who talk about politics, but the whole sort of suite of actions and knowledges and knowledge, those people who are engaged are most responsive to the accountability threat. And so, in conclusion, the first paper was on this implementation intentions, that basically, how do we bridge intentions into behavior? One way is to help people make a plan for doing it. And it has implications for scalable interventions and behavioral science. And another is, how do we motivate people who feel engaged in a domain and know that they should perform a given action? One way is to add the threat of accountability. And it seems to be really potent, and it's consistent with other areas of research that are related. So here's the script that I think the new script is, and I think many of you will be either receiving it or making it. Lots of others will vote. Join them, voters like you, make a plan. I may call you back post-election. Thanks for being a voter. And in fact, this a version very similar to this just won the Gold Poly Award, which is like the awards for political consultants for the best get out the vote phone script, and it basically included all of these elements. And so with that, thanks. That's it. So we have time for questions, Frank? Okay. Yes?
Is there any difference between those states where you vote by mailing in as opposed to actually going to?
We have not seen that systematically, but I do think that there's something useful to think about. So Oregon, Washington are all vote by mail states. Colorado, California, and about 10 other states are majority vote by mail, not by law, but just by practice. And it gives us, in voter mobilization, but I think true as we think about other domains that we care about, a lot of the treatments that we think about, we can administer in a moment, but we're really targeting a behavior that's later. And it's hard to either find exactly the right moment where it'll grow over time, or find exactly the right moment that immediately precedes the action. But with vote by mail, it gives us the opportunity that we can actually ask people to perform the behavior they intend to perform immediately upon our communicating with them. So if we're asking people to get their flu shots or to lose weight or to save money, these are all things that we're doing some intervention now, and it all sort of goes off into the distance, and it's hard to do interventions. It's hard, and we've seen some amazing ways to do it. But one-off behaviors, these things are especially potent for. Okay. Yes?
Curious if any of this research has been applied globally, especially in emerging democracies.
So I know that it's been applied in Europe. I don't know, in a couple of South American countries because they import a lot of political practices. But I think that the levers are going to be even more basic in emerging democracies where there's corruption problems and in
like the accountability message might be really counterproductive. That would be like, yes.
And it's not in truth in a lot of other political contexts. Voting data is not public, and so it's a relatively unique in the U.S. in all of the U.S. except Virginia, which does not share it. Yes.
Do you ever think people are going to be feeling like they've been messaged, that they're going to turn off to it? Because I mean, I was on the trail, from Puerto Rico all over 37 states, and you message people to death, and then now, are we going to start to see some drop off from that?
That's perfectly sensible. The question is diminishing marginal return.
Yes.
Yes. And so I think plan making especially, given what we saw is that if people appear to have already had a plan making treatment should have trivial impact. And so now if we're in a world where most voter mobilization efforts involve making a plan, the marginal impact of an additional one is going to be trivial. So yeah, I think that there are sort of equilibrium effects.
Website or whatever, something more.
So texting is a great example.
Yeah.
6, texting appeared to be really effective. Currently, it's just every year the treatment effect shrinks because people are getting more accustomed to text and they're getting more of them. Yeah. Yes?
I'm wondering if what you're describing this is a planning failure. You say, are you going to vote yes?
Yes.
And so the difference between them saying yes and, well, what time will you vote, these other things, you're describing that gap as a planning failure. And I propose an alternate explanation, which is, so Cialdini talks about consistency as one of these levers. And so each time you say, well, what time will you vote? They'll say, okay, 9 a.m. And that's sort of reinforcing, and I'm going to vote. Mm-hmm. And so basically this time you're getting them to say, I will vote 4 times. And you're reinforcing the consistency. Well, I said, so essentially you're regardless of what you're having them say,
right.
You're having them affirm 4 times now that they're going to vote. And so the drive towards consistency is like, well, I really damn well better vote now.
Right. Yeah.
So
that is an interpretation that's consistent with the treatment. The fact that people who organically plan, who already organically have plans are less responsive is more consistent with the plan making story than it is a multiple commitment. But yeah, and so that's why we replicate. That's why we borrow from. We do things in the lab and then we do them in other domains. But that's a perfectly valid interpretation of that treatment. Yes.
I'm just wondering how negative messages work with voting. Like, don't use it, lose it. You lose your voice if you don't vote. Does that work? Do people do that?
They do that in Singapore. It's legal. Everybody has to vote. If you don't vote, you lose your right to vote.
Is that right?
Yeah.
You can't ever earn it back?
No, you can reinstate yourself if you have a legit reason for why you don't vote.
Yeah, so it's like a weaker version of C. Diddy's Vote or Die. If anybody remembers this,
Yeah.
04. I don't know of research on that, but what we do find is that unless it is, so what we have found is that like various messaging forms, much like the early research, unless it is really has an underlying psychological component that is sort of informed by theory, the messaging hasn't really mattered that much in the voter mobilization. But certainly in persuasion, that stuff matters a lot. Yeah. one, two, and then I think we're.
When someone, you were mentioning something about the developing world, and you said something about corruption in the elections.
Yes.
And I was thinking, well, he didn't say anything about corruption in U.S. elections.
No, yeah. So there's interesting research recently that it turns out for a fraction of the electorate, they just don't believe that their ballots are secret. So the actual content of their ballot, and so messaging that actually says that your ballot is secret seems to be interestingly potent at increasing people's likelihood of voting. Meaning that one of the reasons people aren't voting is because they feel that their vote will be the actual content of their vote will be public, which is interesting and in line with that. Yes, I mean, certainly there is a long history of corruption at different levels even in U.S. elections.
Telling them if you knew they voted, doesn't that kind of give you a sense that you might also know how I voted?
Yes, in the 2012 elections, we're looking at that. Yeah, they certainly run different directions. Yeah.
Since you have such large samples and it sounds like you know so much about these voters, did you see a lot of difference in terms of either generation or political ideology, and also for the groups who are sort of cynical overall? Did this actually reinforce the cynicism, or did it in any way?
So the question is, are there other heterogeneities that are of interest? There are not consistent ones, and so usually I need to replicate stuff before I believe that it is true, and so almost certainly there will be weird heterogeneities, but there doesn't appear to be. Young people vote at a lower rate, but to the extent that we reach them, they're responsive to this addition. Older people vote at a higher rate and they're responsive, but that's what the experiment allows us to really just isolate the causal effect, given everything else equal. But so nothing really stands out. But young people vote at a lower rate. Yeah. Frank, I think I'm. Oh, good. Okay. Okay. I saw there was one. We can take. Oh, yes.
So I'm curious, as an academic, how you're able to make use of the increased data that comes from all the messaging that's happening online these days. And that's really Silicon Valley.
Yeah. So there will be $8 billion spent in politics in elections in 2012. About 300 million of that, which is objectively a lot of money, but relatively very little, will be spent on voter mobilization. Almost the vast majority of the rest of it will be spent in some way trying to change people's opinions. And online is great at tracking behaviors, but most of the time people are trying to send messages to people who don't want to receive them, which is, and so for that space where you're trying to message to people who aren't interested, it's really just passive exposure, which is not what online is great for. So a lot of people sort of focus online as ways to communicate to people who already are interested and fundraise and get volunteering and whatever else. So the online is great for communicating with people who are already interested, but the vast majority of political activity seems to be focused to people who don't want to be the focus of political activity. And online's not perfect for that. All right.